Hello, class. So this is lesson three's lecture, A New Nation. There's a lot of statistical information in this lesson, so you might have to go back and listen to this several times. There's also a chronological order when it comes to the presidencies. I'm going to go through that very quickly. If you need to know more information about their political views or stances and some of the things that happened during their administration, you can refer back to your textbook for more clarity. So in 1781, the Second Continental Congress set up a plan for government called the Articles of Confederation. Now, under this plan, most governmental power was held by the states. Now, this allowed each state to have one vote in Congress, and this vote really mattered when we were talking about things like declaring war. Now, the central government during this time was still very weak. It was unable to collect taxes, regulate trade, easily pass or enforce any laws. So they had to do something to strengthen the government to make it more cohesive, right? In order for it to be something that can run the populace, negotiate trades and different things. And as we go through the sequence of presidents, we'll start hearing about how they were able to strengthen the central government, expand the Supreme Court through acts like nullification and different things like that. So now the delegates called to the Constitutional Convention decided to abandon the Articles of Confederation and form a new government based on the Constitution. So this is the first conversation about the Constitution and the different amendments that come along as the presidents change position throughout this time frame. Now, the Great Compromise promised a two-house Congress. Now, each state would be equally represented in the Senate, but representation in the House of Representatives would be based on population size. And that's something that we still see to this day, where there's a representative of the Senate from each state, and the House, who has like 33 individuals, is based on the size of the populace in the United States. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise established that three-fifths of a state's slaves could be counted as part of the population. And this, once again, was a way for them to garner more seats in the House, right? Because these individuals at this time were not deemed as property or not deemed as people, right? They were essentially property, but as a way to mitigate and to create a loophole, they were able to count the slaves for this purpose only. Now, that was later repealed, right? The Three-Fifths law that said that black people were three-fifths of white people. Essentially, once again, it was a political loophole, and that was covered by the 14th Amendment, which made them citizens after 13th Amendment got rid of this idea of slavery, except for imprisonment. Now, the delegates went on to divide power between the states and the national government in a system called federalism. Now, this had three branches of the government, which we still have today: legislative, executive, and judicial. And they also had an amendment process for the Constitution. And you'll learn about that a little bit more when we start deep diving into the Constitution. We start talking about how its formation, its amendments, and different things like that. So now the Federalists supported the ratification of the Constitution because it balanced powers between the different houses. Now the Anti-Federalists opposed having a strong government, right? They wanted a smaller government. Sounds a little bit more when we start getting into political ideology, sounds a little bit more like the Republicans who want small government versus the Democrats who want more big government. And so the Federalists agreed to the Anti-Federalist demands that there be a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. Now, we're talking about shaping the nation, and so we have President George Washington, and Congress now have to put the new plan into practice. Now, Congress established the Department of State and the Department of Treasury to assist the president. Soon, they became part of the president's cabinet or their chief advisors, and that's something that we still see today, where the president actually picks his cabinet, the people that are going to advise him during his presidency. Now, the Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, proposed the formation of a national bank. The cabinet members debated whether the Constitution could be strictly or loosely interpreted. And this is important because of the interpretation now set by the Supreme Court. Oftentimes that is not a literal interpretation, right? When we look at the Constitution, oftentimes it can be seen as ambiguous because when this Constitution was written, it was written during that time frame. different things were going on, different ideologies. And so now when we look at the Constitution, we have to look at it from current day, right? So if we looked at the words that are in the Constitution, we could read them as black and white, but they wouldn't fit for our time frame. So we always have to remember that the words aren't literal, right? They're a way for us to get like a foundation or a framework, and then from there apply it the best way we can for the society as a whole. Now, we have a two-party system. You have the Federalists, who wanted a strong central government, while the Democratic Republicans wanted strong state governments. Okay? Congress passed a protective tariff or import tax on goods produced overseas. Now, this caused a rebellion over the new tax on whiskey, which forced the government to actually exert its authority by sending in armed forces. And you see this almost mimic what happened with the Boston Tea Party, where the British sent in their troops in order to get the colonists under control when they were dumping their tea into the ocean, right? Now, in 1796, John Adams wins the presidency. He is a Federalist. And the Democratic Republican candidate Thomas Jefferson becomes his vice president. Now, later down the line, we start seeing how the vice president and the president have to be a part of the same party, because before this, they were not, right? So if you don't have people on the same team, there tends to be a lot of division. And we're going to start seeing this now, where there were the Northerners, right, that supported Adams, and the Southerners supported Jefferson. So that created not only a divide in the government, but it created a divide amongst the states. And so sectionalism, or placing the interests of a region ahead of the nation as a whole, is something that was a fear during this time, right? Instead of looking as a nation as a whole, there were sections, right? The North and the South that would put their needs before everything that was going on for the country in its totality. So Adams' Federalist Party pushed through the Alien and Sedition Act, which resulted in Democratic Republicans being punished for criticizing the government. So this is the first time that people could not openly say anything negative about its federal government. Now, the state of Kentucky asserted the principle of nullification. And this is when the Congress was able to say, they were able to say that the Congress was unconstitutional and would continue, and this act would actually continue to be controversial. And this is something that we even see now in our own states or in our own government, where people try to nullify other people's actions, nullify policies that are coming before the floor. And so this was something that was inserted into this time frame by Kentucky. And so now we're going into the Jeffersonian era, where Thomas Jefferson narrowly defeated Adams for president in 1800s. Now, Congress soon passed the 12th Amendment. So all through this, right, we had 11 other amendments that we haven't really talked about. But they were quickly putting forth amendments, right? Putting this Constitution together, creating this government, creating stability. Now, after the 12th Amendment, things sort of slowed down, right? And so these other 13 to 14 amendments took a little longer to get on the floor, right? Because with them forming the government so quickly, they just needed to get something on paper, right? And I'm not saying that it wasn't well thought out, because it was, right? What I'm saying is that they understood that in order for them to survive, because they were trying to break away from Europe, they needed to have a strong government, a strong military, a way to protect its citizens. So now, Jefferson practiced a theory of government that became known as the Jeffersonian Republicanism. He believed that a simple government best suited the needs of the people, not strong central government like some of the Federalists, like John Adams. And so he believed that they needed to work on shrinking the government and cutting the costs, because being able to have a strong central government meant that you spent a lot of money. And so at this time, while they weren't bringing in a lot of revenue, they had to cut the costs, shrink government. And that's something that we often hear Republicans say, right? Smaller government, cut costs, cut back on the social welfare programs, right? To save money in order to put that money into like military and other things that go into our GDP. And so during this time frame, the Supreme Court struck down a law Congress had passed. Now, in doing so, they established this whole principle of judicial review, right? Before the Supreme Court was like, there's a court that was there, right? They had power, but they really didn't. And when they started to exert their their power through like striking down laws that the Congress made, going into judicial review, looking at the constitutionality of a lot of these policies, they started to establish their voice. So now, Thomas Jefferson's presidency is perhaps best remembered for the Louisiana Purchase. Buying the Louisiana Territory from France nearly doubled the size of the United States. Because remember, at this time, we still had the 13 colonies. They were starting to branch off a little bit more. When we look at the French territory was vast. And when they purchased that, they doubled it. And so Jefferson asked two explorers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, or Lewis and Clark as we know them, to explore the new territory and report their findings back to him, right? Because this area had not been explored, right? We were not on this land. We purchased it from the French, had no idea what was on it. So we needed to go in and for lack of a better word, what they do, and we had to make a list of things that was going on in this region. So now we have James Madison, who saw the country through the War of 1812, and Monroe helped the United States gain economic independence from Europe by establishing a protective tariff and rechartered the National Bank. Okay, now, the Federalist Party during this time ended because of their opposition of the War of 1812. And people weren't really feeling the fact that they didn't support the war. So their party was essentially disintegrated, which left the Democratic Republican Party, and eventually those two split as well. Okay, so now nationalism and sectionalism. Now we have foreign affairs dominated the first term of President James Monroe, who was elected in 1816. Now, his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, based his foreign policy on nationalism, this idea of putting national interests ahead of regional issues. So once again, we were dealing with things like sectionalism, right, where you had the North and the South, who were like, we don't see ourselves as a whole. We're two separate United States. And there was a lot of infighting there. But now you have Adams, who's like, no, we believe that this is all one country. We need to come together under one ideology so that we can persevere and survive. Now, the United States was also expanding, right? And they were able to claim Florida and other parts that stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So now they're moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And President Monroe established what he called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, it warned Europeans not to take any part in what was happening in the Western Hemisphere. So they were warning them like, hey, what's going on over here is none of your business, and what's going on over there is none of our business. So once again, they're separating themselves from Europe, establishing their own government, and letting Europe run itself the way they want, and they too were looking for their individuality here. Now, we still have some division between the North and the South. And so the North, their industries thrived in this area, right? You had a lot of manufacturing, you had the ports in Boston, so there was a lot of import and exporting. And the South primarily found its wealth in agriculture and slavery. Now, most of the Northerners were pleased with the tariffs. It was good for them, business-wise, right? The Southerners were like, we really don't care because we really don't have import-export. We have slaves in agriculture, and our agriculture isn't being exported. It's being utilized, locally. Sometimes it's being sent to the North, depending. So they didn't really think it was necessary. Now, the Northerners and the Southerners also disagreed about admitting new states, right? Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise temporarily solved this problem between the North and the South disagreeing about these states, right? It admitted Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. So Maine is up north, right? So there's no slavery there. But Missouri, which is a little further down, but it's in the Midwest, they stated that that's going to be a slave state. And so Louisiana was also divided into two territories. One part was slavery and the other part was not. So they were trying to solve all these problems by creating free states and slave states, trying to appease both sides. Now, during the age of Jackson, we have Andrew Jackson, who became president following John Quincy Adams' single term in office. Now, Jackson won the election with the promise to give common people greater political power. So, this whole idea of the common man being part of the political faction was relatively new. Now, one of the ways that Jacksonian democracy worked was through this spoil system, in which he allowed government positions to be filled with his friends and political allies, right? So this is the first time you see non-career politicians filling these seats, common folks, for lack of a better word. And then with Jackson's approval, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which ordered Native Americans to move west. And this is where you see the Cherokee Indians saying, no, we're not going to leave. But unfortunately, they were forcefully removed from their land. And this whole idea of being forced west is what we hear about when we hear about the Trail of Tears. Now, Jackson was a man who had many contradictions, right? He defended federal powers, but at the same time, he really didn't like the National Bank. Excuse me. So think of that as you may when it comes to him and his presidency, but I have some speculation, but I'll leave that for our discussion. Outside of that, that is your lecture for the day. Take a moment and look at these administrations and compare them to our current administrations and the things that currently still happen in the United States, especially when it comes to our tariffs, when it comes to our party system. It comes to the ways that certain states handle certain things. We can look at COVID, right? We have some states that supported the mandate, some states who did not. And a lot of that ties back to these administrations and how they ran their presidency. All right, students, this is lecture 3. Make sure you answer the questions and submit them. You can submit them in Google Classroom. You do not need to submit them in Schoology. I will be checking both. Just a quick reminder, in regards to late work, it loses 1 point, right, for its late submission. Eventually, you will not be able to submit it. I only take late work 1 week after the due date. After that, I will not submit it. Excuse me, I will not grade it. I will just give it a 0. Okay? Outside of that, I hope your vacation was well, and I'll see you tomorrow.